Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Lester. I'm with University of Florida IFAS Extension Service in Hernando County, Florida. And let me keep admitting even more people here. For everybody that was with us yesterday, welcome back. And for everybody who wasn't able to be with us yesterday, welcome. Today is day number 2 of our home hydroponics workshop. And need everybody to be patient here for a moment, still letting people in. Okay, I think almost everybody, I'm just gonna have to keep clicking and letting people in. We have a nice large group here with us today. So for everybody who didn't catch it, my name is Bill Lester. I'm with University of Florida Extension in Hernando County, Florida. And welcome to day number 2 of our home hydroponics workshop. I wanted to mention to everybody once again, please keep your cameras and your microphones off. That really cuts down on the background noise and it's a lot less distracting for the speakers. If you have a question or if you need to ask anything, if you look at the very bottom of your page, you're going to see something that says chat. So you can go ahead and type your question in the chat box. Now, after each presenter, we are going to be taking some questions. So you can go ahead and type your question into the chat box and we'll go ahead and answer them. The problem is if we end up with lots and lots of questions, we really don't want to be here all day long and start cutting into dinner time. So what we're planning on doing is all of us are going to get together and pick a date in about 3 weeks. And we're going to be back on Zoom. And we'll try to be back on Facebook Live also at the same time to answer any questions. Because I know a lot of times people will watch a workshop, they'll start putting together a hydroponic system, and that's when the questions start coming up. So we're going to try to get back together just for answering your questions. Let me go ahead and let this one person in here. So we're going to schedule that. And for everybody who signed up, on Zoom, we have your name and your email address. We'll go ahead and email it to you. For anybody who is just watching us on Facebook Live, keep following our Facebook pages. We'll go ahead and make numerous posts about it, about when we're going to be available to come back on and answer your questions. And we're aiming to do that in about 3 weeks or so. Let me go ahead and share my screen right here, and I will show this again before the end of the day. We will have a website where we're going to have extra resources and recordings of all the presentations from yesterday and today. So if you want to go ahead and write this down, hernandoextension.com/home-hydroponics-made-easy. That's kind of a long name, but if you write that down, please don't go to it today and don't go to it tomorrow. We will have everything up for you by Monday. But if you go there anytime Monday or afterwards, totally open to the public. You won't need a password to get into it. And we will have copies of our PowerPoints. We'll try to put recordings of the presentations up there so you can watch them again. And lots of extra resources also. So like I said, I will show that once again before the end of the day. Let me go ahead and stop sharing and get back here. So let's go ahead and get started. Let a few more people in here today. I'd like to introduce Dr. John Roberts. He's with University of Florida Extension in Orange County, and he's going to talk all about growing microgreens hydroponically. So I'm sure you guys are all looking forward to that. John, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. Let me try and get this up here. Share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to try and cover a lot of ground here pretty fast. This is the hydroponics. Like we're trying to cover material related to hydroponics, and there's a little nuance here between hydroponic ways of growing this versus like in media, traditional media. So that gets a little more complicated, but I'll try and get us through here pretty quick. So microgreens, their origin, what we know in the literature is that they started in the 1980s. Like they think out of the San Francisco area, people at Seed Catalog started marketing them, and like where you could buy the seeds in bulk and start growing them for, in areas that you couldn't grow gardens as extensively. And like, I guess the term they used a lot of the time was seed confetti because of this. And I guess the biological aspect to them is that they are cotyledons. Like this is if you go back to your botany, this is, like monocots versus dicots. This is when the plants are in the earliest phases of growing their foliage. And the cotyledon stage is the part that you harvest and eat here. It's the first true leaf that comes out of the plant. So or out of the seed. And so I guess there's a big difference here between sprouts and microgreens. And sprouts have less requirements in terms of environmental needs. They can be grown in the dark is the biggest thing compared to microgreens. While microgreens, they need growth medium, ventilation, and light. And additionally, they differ in that microgreens take longer generally to grow. They typically have a little more nutritional value, and they're used a little bit more like salads, although they can both be used as side garnishes and things like that, additions to a lot of food. Microgreens versus baby greens. Microgreens are smaller. The leaves of baby greens are developing more adult, mature characteristics and texture. However, there's technically no legal background or breakdown between the two. There's a lot of advantages for growing microgreens. They take little room. Any time of year you can grow them if you have the right environment. Typically indoors. They have concentrated nutrition and taste. You get a fast harvest, and they're typically pretty low cost. Disadvantages are that you might have short harvest windows, which is good. Why you have to do a lot of planning potentially if you want to have a continuous source of them. They don't last that long, and some of the seeds can be expensive depending on what you're trying to grow. So typically we break them down in the different types of seeds that you can get and plants you grow based on how fast they grow. The brassicas, so the mustard family, like kale, broccoli, that type of thing, and radishes tend to grow fast, 3 to 10 days. Intermediate, amaranth, beets, carrots, to a certain degree, chards. Certain brassicas also that are pretty widely used are intermediate. Slow, carrots, and most herbs. And typically, the slower growing ones are also the more difficult to grow too. So just to kind of highlight here, there are a lot of options that you've got botanically. Some of the more common ones here are amaranth, basil, cilantro, celery. And then you have many brassicas to choose from. These are super common and among the easiest to grow typically. So, and things that fit in this category are broccoli, kale, bok choy, Tokyo bacana, mustard, arugula, cabbage, garden cress. So, and then there's some other common plants that people grow. Endive, they're pretty good. They're more similar to lettuce. Peas are a legume, and they also are sweet relative to most other types of microgreens. And the radish is technically, it's in the brassica too, but I ran out of room on the other page. And they have a spicy taste, and they're usually some of the fastest growing basically. Beet family, beets and chards, they have more of an earthy taste, and there's a lot of different colors available in them for people that are into that. So with that, there's still a lot of other options out there too. Sunflower, buckwheat, onion, beans. And there are also all sorts of herbs that you can do. As mentioned, they kind of grow slower, but they tend to have more of a flavor punch if that's what you're looking for out of these. So there are a few plants that are unsuited for most microgreen operations. Lettuce, it's still possible to grow it, but it tends to be a more difficult microgreen to grow because it doesn't have very developed cell walls and it doesn't have a very developed stem, so it doesn't stand up straight. It tends to adhere to the bottom of the pans that you use or to each other, which can lead to problems with getting enough ventilation, things like that. So it's just worth keeping in mind if you want something more like lettuce, endives are usually a better selection. They're in the same family and have a pretty similar taste. Another big one to try and avoid is Solanaceae plants, tomato, pepper, potato, eggplants. They have certain alkaloids in the foliar parts of the plants and definitely not edible. So, I mean, basic equipment that you need to do it, commonly like 10 by 20 trays are standard, but there are many options that you can use potentially: pie pans, food containers, disposable plates, that type of thing. And then, like, where do you get soil and like some of the hydroponics supplies? You can usually get them at local garden stores and nurseries. And then online, there's plenty of options available too. So I guess in terms of containers, as I mentioned, these 10 by 20 flats are pretty common. Typically, you want them to be 2 to 3.5 inches deep. And if you can get them to have a little bit of drainage, that's usually good too. You might need to put another container underneath them to get the excess water that's coming out of them. Let's see here too. But be prepared to grow microgreens. A lot of them, if you grow them in these 10 by 20 flats, these are kind of the commercial standard. So here's just many different sizes that are available here. And you can see you can break it down all different kinds of ways. They sell them compartmentalized in many different ways as well if you're trying to grow different things. So it's worth keeping in mind. There are a lot of options out there on how to do this. So I guess it brings us to seeds and where to get the seeds. Typically, Johnny's is one of the biggest companies that does microgreens. It's what I've been using. You can see here, you can get them in like pound or quarter pound, ounce, different sizes. Obviously, buying in bulk helps, keeps the price down. And I mean, in the beginning, when you're experimenting, you might want to try a lot of different things, but just keep in mind that like the price can get pretty high if you do too much of it, because you want, like, the advantages is getting things in bulk. Generally, as you can see here, the radishes and a lot of the brassicas tend to be cheaper, but like at the same time, some of these other things that like you would think might be cheaper, like some of the, like the Swiss chard and things like that, they can be kind of expensive if they're in mixes, like like for different colors and things like that. You might pay a premium for those types of things. Oh, and something else to pay attention to is, like, because of where we're at right now, Johnny's website, I just took a look at today. They're open to non-commercial beginning April 28th. They're only open up to commercial currently. And then I looked at Parker's and Burpees, and they're currently sold out of all of their microgreens mixes. So germination, usually the soil medium that you want to use, like if you're going this route, they specifically market germination mixes or starter mix, growing mix, and it's typically pretty sterile. But you need something that's sterile, has a decent supply of oxygen, is able to retain moisture, and you really don't want to mess around with fertilizer for the most part. Like microgreens require a few more steps typically, or a little bit more advanced knowledge on how to grow them. Some seeds you require that you soak them prior. And beets, cilantro, buckwheat, peas, sunflower, nasturtium, popcorn, and winter wheat. They all respond much better and favorably like when you put them in the water beforehand. So that brings us to comparing the media to these fabric mats that you might have available, like that is more of the hydroponic way of growing things. The media, usually there's some advantages in that they're more easily available. Most places have potting or growing mix, potting mix, that type of thing that you can use. And there are also more options available for you for containers. Because a lot of times you might want to be using circular containers. If you are trying to cut some of the fabric or mats to these circular containers, you're going to lose a lot of extra material if you're not cutting them to rectangles. So that's just something to keep in mind, especially like early on while you're trying these things out. I mean, most people have rectangular containers later on, but if you're just trying it out here in the beginning, probably worth just using the medium because there are more advantages in terms of containers. Cons, more potential for contamination if you're not careful what medium you're using. And it usually is a little more messy and requires a little more cleanup for the media. As I've mentioned, the fabric, the good thing about them is they're easier in terms of care, but also if you can set them up the right way, like they become self-watering, the water does the work, as we mentioned. Typically, they require a little more setup and forethought, and that's why they're a little bit more advanced. But if you do it, you plan it the right way, you can do it from the beginning as well. So with all of that, let's see here, germination. Most germination media are a mix of peat moss, coconut fiber, vermiculite, and perlite. You can use them all kind of by themselves, but usually it's better to mix them a little bit. You can also buy them pre-mixed. Typically, it's worth keeping in mind you want about 10 seeds per square inch, in particular for the brassicas, which tend to have small seeds. So, and then the fabric materials that I was talking about, that from the more hydroponic approaches, you would typically have this burlap type material and market it as organic a lot of times, and that just means it's just made of carbon. And then biostraight felt is something that's out there that's marketing in the market. And then micromats. So micromats are similar to the burlap and the biostraight, and they're pretty easily customizable. They're for hydroponic cultures made of wood fiber, and they can be composted once you're done with them. And unless the roots are really well developed, like they'll fall apart if you're not careful when taking them out. So it's also worth keeping in mind that media, growing mix is better for a lot of seeds than the mats. Like some of them won't grow correctly or need to develop more of a root system. So the beets, buckwheat, cilantro, chard, nasturtium, peas, sunflower are all some of the ones that respond more favorably to growing in a medium, soil medium. So just check packets and catalogs specifically before you go ahead and set your seeds. It's also worth keeping in mind some of the plants seeds have mucilaginous coats, and it's very important to keep these. It's even more important, I guess you should say, to keep these seeds wet, because they will if they don't stay wet, they typically will go back into dormancy somewhat. So that's just something to keep in mind. And some of the seeds that do that are basil, chia, and cress. Water quality is something else that you have to think about. Some seeds are sensitive to chlorine. Just be aware of that with tap water. And then on top of that, some, as Hannah was talking about yesterday, managing the pH is important. Typically, slightly acidic around 6 is considered to be the best. You can get the strips. They're very cheap for testing pH and water. And if you need to make adjustments, they recommend using to acidify the water that a little vinegar or lemon juice can help sometimes. So I guess there are also different demands for light and darkness when you're trying to get the seeds to germinate. And light cover requirements vary by species. As mentioned, the ones that don't require cover tend to be towards the brassica, but some of the herbs are also in that category: lemon balm, mint, oregano. Most things prefer a little bit of light cover, and some are 100% coverage. But there's a little bit of forgiveness to all this, and you'll kind of have to work it out on your own, to see what happens. Generally, you want to err towards the side of covering things, because even these things that require no cover, they'll typically germinate when they have some cover on them. So here's just an example of a mat that was grown in the dark, and then after 9 hours of now that the seeds have germinated and exposed, on the right hand side you can see what it looks like after 9 hours of exposure. Due to activation of photosynthesis in the chlorophyll, the plants have changed pretty rapidly in that time. And then here's just another example of mat versus soil and what you might expect. The soil media is on the left here, and as you can see, it's a little more messy. It's a little more, looks like there's a little bit less support. Like the seeds have responded more growing sideways and things like that compared to these mats. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that the mats tend to produce neater looking seeds that might be easier to harvest as well. Most seeds, most of the seeds, when you're using media, they're small, and they are typically in the range, you want 10 to 12 seeds per square inch typically. Except for, there are some exceptions, and let's see here. So yeah, broadcast them in the row. You want them, 6 to 8 seeds per inch for 6 to 8 per square inch for the larger seeds. And you can broadcast them, or you can put them in rows. Typically you broadcast them. So, and then from there, you gently want to press them into the surface when you're growing them in the medium. You can, mist them with a bottle sprayer, and they typically want a little bit of warmth, a little bit. There are some temperature requirements. You usually want to be above 70 or so, but it kind of depends on the species of microgreen that you're trying to grow. Gently press them in, moisten them, keep them in the dark, and then mist them twice a day. Typically when you get up and before you go to sleep. Keep covered during root development. And once the first true leaves come out, these cotyledons, remove the cover and place it in light. If you can find a good south-facing window where they'll get a little bit more direct light, that's probably the ideal place to put them in your house. And then from there, turn it 100 degrees each day so that they don't grow just in one direction. They'll grow more uniformly straight up. So some of the potential problems that you might encounter is with seed concentration. Too many or too little seeds. Typically, too many tends to be the problem with this, and then they don't get enough aeration, not enough light. you want to try and make sure to get the 6 hours of light per day typically. Temperature, too warm or too cold. Like I said, most require about 70, but check the individual packages. And irrigation, too dry or too wet. Like both are not good typically. You just want it, it's the Goldilocks zone. You want it just a little bit moist at all times. And then also inconsistent conditions. If you're moving them all over and certain parts of the house are warmer or colder than others, or if there's different light, like the seeds just might go back into dormancy. So here's a typical problem that happens growing in too high of a concentration or having too much water. What happens is the bacteria, it'll get too wet, and then a lot of times bacteria start to colonize the microgreens, and you'll typically notice that there's a little bit of an odor or smell associated with them when they get to this point. So, and just to highlight kind of what I pointed out before, the different, when you take them out of being covered, you can see on the left, that's what they look like. They're pretty yellow. And if you can see my screen, I've got some started here, and they're a little bit more on the yellow side. These are all brassica. Specifically, I think that these are kale. And then I've got some, I think, let's see what I got here. I got beets going here. You see those? They got that nice red color. So you place, and I started these on Monday, so it's been 3-4 days. So yeah, they respond quite rapidly, like when you need to expose in the light here. So these brassicas are ready pretty much. The beets that I've got here are going to take a little bit more time though. So something to keep in mind is they don't really require fertilizer. They're not growing long enough in most cases. But water, make sure that they're wet but not overwatered. You don't want them damping off. That's when they start to get disease and or colonized by fungus, bacteria. It's best to water from bottom if you can, but misting is fine too in most cases, just particularly when you're just starting out and trying this for the first time. Keep peas on the dry side. They have more problems with moisture and damping off. And garnet amaranth is one of these more technical ones. People like it because of the color, but it adheres to the ground a lot of the time too, kind of like lettuce, like I mentioned. So just to kind of cover these conditions again, just always keep in mind your irrigation regime: moist, not flooded, mist or lightly water twice per day, light. It's required after germination. Typically you need 6 hours or more. Put in a south-facing window if you have one, and rotate 100 degrees every day. Temperature, typically 70-75, check the package. Humidity, less than 50% or greater than 50%. Otherwise, you're gonna deal with a lot of drying out of your seeds. Harvesting, usually you want to do this at 2 to 3 inches tall. And I guess it's usually like there are better times of day than others, night or morning. And because the plants are responding differently, moving around different, we don't really see it because, but at those points of days, it's a little bit more ideal for cutting them. And wash and spin dry with a salad spinner if you have that available. That simplifies things quite a bit particularly if you're growing them in a medium. And then you can refrigerate them in, Tupperware plastic containers. So when you harvest, just cut a little bit above the soil line. You don't want to usually consume the whole thing. It's usually better to try and use scissors and cut them out. And I guess for these you have options after you harvest them. In particular, you can let them keep growing. Some of them respond better to this than others, and you'll get a second or third flush in some cases. And just try cutting as needed. This is a good way if you want to extend your harvest and have fresh greens for a longer time. You can do it this way. Just keep cutting them. So, and some there's some uses for them. You can throw them in all sorts of stuff. People throw them on pizza as well, things like that. But it's just worth keeping in mind that a lot of the reason people like them is because they have more intense flavor. That's why they're used as a garnish a lot of the time on dishes. The science in terms of them being more nutritious, they do tend to have higher concentrations of certain vitamins and things like that. And usually the more color to them, the more nutritious. So I think that on some of these things, they can have up to 4 or 5 times more nutrition value per size compared to like the full size leaves that you would get in lettuce. So, and that's here, 4 to 40 times more concentration with nutrients. So, but as mentioned, it's pretty limited in terms of the data that's out there. This is kind of a relatively new phenomenon that food science is looking at. And some of them do have protein in them. Buckwheat is a good example. It has pretty high protein for a plant. And then I guess also some of the beans and peas would probably also fall into that category. So yeah, typically like this is done at 5 to 10 days. And you know, that is, I mean, that tends to be much more for your easier ones to grow, like your brassicas, your cabbages, broccoli, kale, etc. So taking what we've talked about here, that there's a lot of things that you can do on your own. Try different things. See what you like, and I mean, start trying to keep a log and see what works for you. You can start timing your production cycles, and you can have a constant source of greens if you do it the right way. Like don't have to go to the grocery store every time you want to get salad if you do it like that. So, and I mean, we typically don't have enough greens in our diet as it is, and it's a good way to do it. So here's some resources that are attached here. I think we'll try and put some other stuff up online. But with that, I'm going to conclude here. I'll try and answer whatever comes up in terms of questions, like in the chat box. I'm going to pass it over to Bill here for his presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. That was really great. So if anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and put them down at the very bottom. If you see at the bottom of your screen where it says chat, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box, and John will do his best to go ahead and answer all of them there. Let me move forward here and open up my presentation. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my presentation there on your screen. I guess I'm going to kind of bring up the tail end of the whole workshop here and talk a little bit about some of the different common pests of indoor hydroponic crops. So this goes for whether you're growing your crops purely indoors, or let's say in a covered area, or if you remember Hannah's presentation yesterday, the set it and forget it, crops in a bucket, you can go ahead and use that method and put the buckets outdoors in your backyard. But the problem is, if you put something completely out in the backyard, they're going to be exposed to just as many insects as your vegetable garden in ground would be, with the exception of now they're not really exposed to the soil insects. So really important to mention that if you're doing anything hydroponically, you don't want to be using garden soil. You don't want to be using dirty pots, containers. You want to be sure to clean them very well, sanitize them, because the nice thing about hydroponics is it's a really good way to avoid soil-borne insect pests that are outdoors. But if you're growing things hydroponically in a bucket or containers and you set them completely outdoors, they're just as exposed to insect pests and diseases as any other plants would be out there. You can put things in, and I know a lot of people that do, they put it in a pool enclosure, hobbyist greenhouses, screen porches, and they do partly protect your plants. Generally, what that's going to do is it's going to protect your plants against the larger insect pests you might have to deal with. So you would have far fewer problems with, let's say, stink bugs, caterpillars, because the moths are probably not going to be able to make it into your pool enclosure or your greenhouse, as long as you keep it fairly well buttoned up, or screen porch, anywhere nearly as easy as they would be able to get to a plant that was sitting out in the middle of your backyard. But sometimes when you grow these things kind of semi-inside, you're also blocking a lot of the beneficial insects, because we do have a huge number of species of beneficial insects in our backyards. So wherever you're watching this from, whether it be in Hernando County or Central Florida or any other state, you have pest insects and you're going to have beneficial insects, things like ladybugs, things like parasitoid wasps, that help to keep those pest insects under control. Sometimes when you bring things partway inside, you partly block the pests and you completely block the beneficials. So you're thinking, well, okay, I'm going to go 100%. I'm going to be growing things inside my house, under a grow light, in a spare room, something like that. And that can work very well, but don't think that you don't have bugs in your house. I mean, nothing personal, but we all have insects in our house, because so many of these different plant pests are so small. And it's interesting because the way that aphids, mealy bugs, spider mites, and a lot of other small insects get around is they actually blow in the wind. So I know researchers have looked before about what exactly is blowing in the wind, let's say 50, 100 feet up above us, and they've actually put nets up that high and caught everything that was blowing by. And they found huge numbers of things like aphids and spider mites and mealy bugs. Especially with spider mites, they take a little bit of that webbing and they wave it in the breeze, and a little breeze catches them and they float higher and higher. They blow down the street. When they fall out of the breeze, they land in my yard, they land in your yard. I'm sure many of you either have or have had houseplants before, and you know that even houseplants can get insect pests. Most commonly, they tend to be mealy bugs, spider mites, a few other things. So if you're growing any kind of edible crops indoors also, they're all susceptible to these tiny insects. So you want to, the most important thing that you do to help avoid them is, number one, don't leave the door hanging open. Obviously, you have to come and go into your house, but you want to try to protect them as best you can. But the most important thing you can do is just check your plants regularly. That's basically is called scouting, and we recommend that for people who are growing things indoors or out. You want to scout your plants. So every day or every other day, at a minimum, you want to go and check the plants, check the leaves, turn the leaves over, look at the undersides. You need to purchase yourself a nice hand lens or magnifying glass. I know that hand lenses are also called jeweler's loupes. That's L-O-U-P-E. And you can look online and you can buy them for as little as, $1 or $2 each. You can get very nice ones for a couple dollars each. You definitely want to invest in one, because a lot of the insect pests that you're going to get indoors are going to be very tiny, and you're going to need some kind of magnification to be able to see them. Larger pests that you might deal with out in your backyard, stink bugs, caterpillars, are very easy to see with the naked eye, but not so much the ones that are inside your house. And one problem that you can have with hydroponics that you generally aren't having with your outdoor crops is problems with small flies, things like fungus gnats, fruit flies, phorid flies, and we're going to talk a little bit more about all that. So no matter what you're growing, whether you're growing hydroponic vegetables inside or outside, or a lawn or a palm tree, you want to follow something that's called IPM. That's integrated pest management. That's where you take a lot of different steps to identify and keep on top of all the insect pests and diseases that you have. And the goal is to keep the levels of those insect pests and diseases below a certain point so that they're not damaging or hurting your harvest. So the most important part of IPM is proper identification. So if you think that you have a problem, and I see this on different Facebook groups all the time, somebody will post a question and a picture. I have a tomato plant, there's something wrong with it, I don't know what, but what do I spray on it to kill the bugs? How do you know you have an insect pest unless you actually see that insect? How do you know if you have a disease unless you look very closely at the leaf, use a hand lens, and you know what you're looking for? So proper identification is the most important first step. We here at Extension can't help you come up with a solution if we don't know what the problem is. Like I already mentioned, frequent scouting, and that's basically looking at your plants very, very carefully, turning over the leaves, seeing if something seems out of place. Do the leaves on my lettuce plants start to have spots on them? Are you noticing a foul odor like John mentioned with growing microgreens? Are my fish, floating upside down basically like Maxine talked about yesterday? Those are all indicators of problems, and you're going to catch those problems early, and hopefully you're going to come up with a solution early that, where it's going to actually help and save your crop. Prevention is very, very important. It's so much easier to prevent insect and disease problems than to try to cure them after the fact. And the worst position to be in is when you're not scouting your plants, you let the problem get out of control, then you look for a solution. It becomes really difficult at that point, and that's where you start losing a lot of plants and a lot of fish. And you want to start with safe and effective controls. So I always base my recommendations on the least toxic, safest to use product that is still going to be effective, because there's really no point in purchasing and using something that's organic and totally safe to use if it's not going to solve your problem. That's just kind of common sense. But you don't want to take the other extreme and go out to your backyard shed, grab a bottle of insecticide and, begin with that. Because as a general rule, what we're talking about growing hydroponically is going to be edible crops. And if you're eating these plants and these crops and what you're getting from it, you want to be very careful about exactly what kind of chemical controls you're using. Fortunately, a lot of times we never even get to the point where you're going to have to be considering a chemical control. A lot of times through prevention, through proper identification, and coming up with other cultural controls, you're going to be able to solve your problems without having to resort to those chemicals. So one insect pest that you can get inside is aphids. And I'm sure all the regular gardeners here are familiar with what aphids are. They are a very, very tiny insect. This right here is a picture of a milkweed plant, and the little orange insects with little black legs and antennae on the left-hand side there are all aphids. Aphids are very tiny, and aphids, when they begin to outgrow or their population starts to get too high on a plant, they'll start to give birth to aphids that have little wings. And they don't fly very well, but they can fly well enough to get up off the plant. They get picked up by a breeze. They blow around in the wind. They blow into your back porch, wherever you might be growing your plants. They blow into your house. And then boom, you have one aphid on your plant. Aphids are pretty amazing. There's one of the very few insects that the females give birth to live aphids. And they're born pregnant. Basically, they don't need a male aphid. So all you need is one aphid, and when they start laying baby aphids, boom, 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 all of a sudden you have a huge number of them now. If you're wondering what that is in the center of the picture, the little green caterpillar looking thing there, that's a little beneficial insect that eats aphids. The problem is you're probably not going to have them indoors. If you're growing your plants outdoors, there are plenty of beneficial insects that help keep aphids under controls. Ladybugs are the number one. Everybody knows what a ladybug is. They gobble up aphids all day long. So they're beneficial. If you're growing your plants indoors, you're probably not naturally going to have ladybugs flying around your house, and you probably don't want to purchase and release ladybugs indoors. So scouting your plants, identifying the aphids, catching them when you only have a few at a time, and getting rid of them at that point is definitely the way to go. Aphids have a very distinctive structure. If you're looking at an aphid with a magnifying glass or a hand lens, on the rear end, they have these two little things. They look like little tailpipes that stick out, and they're siphuncuли, that's the technical term for them, and only aphids have this structure. So that's one common pest that you're going to find on your crops. Here's a few more pictures. You see aphids. In Florida, we have a number of different species of them. They can be the very attractive orange, they could be light green, darker green, tan, brown. They kind of run the gamut color-wise. But if you look very closely at their rear end, they have those two little tailpipes sticking out. That's one of the indicators that what you're looking at is an aphid. Spider mites. Spider mites are very common. Outdoors, spider mites become a problem here in Florida during the summer when it gets very hot, very sunny. They really like it where it's very dry, low humidity. So they can do very well inside your house on your plants, because as a general rule, we're keeping our humidity in our houses down at a pretty reasonable level. Spider mites really like that. One way you could tell that it's a mite and not an insect, you might remember from biology class that insects have 6 legs. As a general rule, there's exceptions to everything. If you are looking at the leaves under a hand lens or magnifying glass, and what you're looking at has 8 legs, it's a mite. So mites have 8 legs, insects have 6 legs. Spider mites have a piercing, sucking mouth part. So what they do when they're feeding on plants, they poke into the leaf and then suck out the water and the chlorophyll out of the cells, kind of one cell at a time. But spider mites are another one of those pests that they multiply very, very quickly. You can check plants and only have a few spider mites today. You come back in less than a week and you have what seems like 1 million spider mites. The population can really explode very, very quickly. And spider mites do, when you have a large number of them, create this distinctive webbing for protection. So they don't make a web like a spider would to catch their prey. They create the web for protection because predators, other mites and other insects that would normally eat spider mites, hate the webbing. So they stay away from the webbing. It kind of gives the spider mites a certain amount of protection. And if you look at them under a microscope, the spider mites will actually crawl along the webbing, and it creates almost like a little highway on the plant leaf that they use to get around. So if you turn over a plant leaf, it looks like somebody has been poking it 1,000 times with a pin with white paint. That's kind of what stippling looks like. And you see a pest on the underside of the leaf and webbing, that's probably a spider mite. Here's a few more pictures, and these are magnified. Spider mites are another one of those things that are very, very small. You're going to need a hand lens or magnifying glass. Even then, they could be a little difficult to get a really good look at. Of course, if anybody has a microscope at home, that really helps. Mealy bugs are another very common indoor pest, and if any of you have just regular house plants, you might have had to deal with mealy bugs before. If you look at them, at first glance, they look like little tiny cotton balls, because most species of mealy bugs are white or white, maybe black and white. And what they do is they make a cottony mass to hide under and hide around. It gives them a certain amount of protection also. Mealy bugs also have a piercing, sucking mouth parts, so they crawl around on the plant's leaves and stems and poke into it and suck the water and nutrients and chlorophyll out of it that way also. So if you look at your plants and you see something that looks like a little wad of cotton balls on it, there's a very good chance it's mealy bugs. You may have to take a pin or a toothpick or something and start poking around a little bit. But if you do, you're going to see something that looks like the picture here. Let me see if I can pull up any of my tools here. I haven't really had a chance to do this before. So if you poke around a little bit and you start to see something that looks like this, it's white. Mealy bugs generally have a tail. Some of them have a longer tail than others. This is probably a long tail mealy bug because it has a long tail. And if you are able to roll it over and you're able to see the legs, and it has 6 legs, then it's a mealy bug. So, goodness, let me try to get rid of that drawing here. Let me go back one. See, that's what I get for experimenting with new tools here. Okay, here's some more pictures of mealy bugs. The one on the left is a pink hibiscus mealy bug. They're a little bit pink, like the name implies. Male mealy bugs will actually get wings. So what you see on the right-hand side here is a male mealy bug. You're rarely ever going to see something like this, but if you do, that's what it is. So a little bit more about, John mentioned earlier today with growing microgreens, you're growing them either in media or you're growing them on a mat that you're keeping very, very wet. The fact that you're growing things hydroponically and it's either in water, like Hannah mentioned yesterday, or it's in media, a lot of times you set yourself up for a perfect situation to attract things like fungus gnats, fruit flies, forward flies, and shore flies. And there's a number of different species. These are things that we see a lot of times in people's houses. For example, sorry, let me go back there. For example, I'll get questions and samples at the office. People can get things like forward flies. There's a picture of one right here. You can get them in your house, in your sinks. They can breed in the pipes, and now you have these really tiny little, most people confuse them for fruit flies. That's kind of the catch-all term for all these tiny little flies. Forward flies can also live and breed in any kind of wet soil. Fungus gnats are a very, very common pest in greenhouse operations, and they are caused by very, very wet soil. So a lot of times you're, let me try to erase my thing. There we go. So a lot of times you're creating these problems by keeping the soil or the media too wet. So I know when we work with greenhouse operations, if they start to bring in samples and we see that it's a fungus gnat or a shore fly, we know that they lay their eggs in very, very wet, muddy soil. And that's where the immature flies live and feed and breed. They're going to feed on organic material in the media or in the soil. And then when they hatch and they become adults, they become annoying little flies. Generally, they're not really pests of the plants. If their populations build up to be very large, the immature flies can feed on the plant roots, and of course that damages the plants. But what happens is they become a real annoyance, and the best way to get rid of them is take a real long, hard look at your irrigation or how much you're watering your plants. If you try to get things a little bit drier, and of course you don't want your plants to completely dry out, but if you back off on the water a little bit and you water things thoroughly and you let them drain thoroughly and then water only when it needs it, you can very quickly really reduce the population of things like fungus gnats and shore flies in your house and on your plants also. Obviously, fruit flies, I think we're all familiar with them. If you've ever let a tomato or a banana sit on your counter for too long, it's amazing how quickly those teeny tiny little flies find their way into your house. They find that banana, and now all of a sudden you have these annoying little flies all around. Fruit flies can do the same thing. If you have leaves, plants, organic matter that's sitting there way, way too wet, you could inadvertently be breeding fruit flies also. So all of these are mostly a nuisance. Obviously, we don't want any kind of fruit flies or forward flies or anything like that within our houses or flying around our plants on a screened porch or a swimming pool screen enclosure, because that becomes annoying for everybody. So you want to reduce them. The best way to do that is take a really hard look at the irrigation schedule and how wet you're keeping the soil and changing that. Okay, there we go. So here are some magnified pictures of these flies. Now, like I said, in real life, a lot of these flies are maybe the size of a large grain of pepper. So with the naked eye, you're never going to be able to tell the difference between a forward fly or a fruit fly or shore fly. But we know from looking at them, the picture on the left here is a fruit fly. It has the distinctive, usually spotted wings. It has usually large, colorful eyes. On the right-hand side here, forward flies, also known as drain flies. I think they're really easy to identify because if I look at this under a microscope, If I look at that back leg, you see that big, wide, expanded part of the back leg there? That's very distinctive for forward flies. Like I said, they're common in people's houses. They're also called drain flies. So it could be a normal household pest that, if you're growing hydroponic crops indoors, can become an even bigger pest. So all these different insects that you may be getting indoors from growing your plants, the best defense and the most important thing from a lot of different standpoints is sanitation. Keeping things clean, dry, not having puddles of water, spills, dead leaves off your plants, dead plants, things like that, sitting around wet. That goes a long way towards making it a lot less attractive to many of these pests to move in and lay their eggs and start to reproduce. Because sometimes people will look at something like, let's say, a fly, and they think, well, if I run around and I just swat and kill all the adult flies, I'm going to solve the problem. No, you're not going to solve the problem that way. You have to figure out what you're doing to attract them, where they're breeding, fix that, get rid of that, and break the cycle. And then pretty quickly, you won't have any more adults. Because if all you do is you kill the adults, in 2 or 3 days, all the ones that are like living in that puddle of water or the dead plant or the leaf on the floor are going to emerge, and your cycle is going to go on. You're never actually going to solve the problem. So keep in mind that any kind of wet substrate, and not so much rock wool and synthetic substrates, but definitely if you're using any kind of soilless media, anything that involves peat moss, coconut coir, things like that, that can make a very attractive home for these insects to lay their eggs and breed in. And then, of course, the adults come out and fly around and annoy you. There are some chemical controls that commercial greenhouses use. I've honestly never seen a homeowner that, if you go and practice good sanitation procedures, clean everything up, break the cycle, figure out where they're breeding, you weren't able to solve the problem. Commercially, there are beneficial nematodes that are available that, if you have a problem with fungus, gnats, and shore flies, I wouldn't recommend using any chemicals to help solve the problem for any edible crops. If you have a more serious problem with this, by all means, feel free to, contact me. You guys are going to get all of our contact information when we put together the web page with all of the recordings of the presentations. So feel free to contact me if you need any more specific chemical control information. And I think with that, that's about all I had. Here is my contact information. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here. Like I said, we are going to make all of our contact information available to you. Let me very quickly, since we're reaching the end here, pull up once again for everybody to write down that web address of where you're going to be able to go as of Monday. Don't try to do it today or tomorrow. Give us a chance to finish pulling together the videos and all of our resources and PDFs of the PowerPoints. But we're going to make all of that information available to all of you. So please just go ahead and go to this web page. We will email this out to everybody also. As part of registration, you gave your name and your email. So we'll just turn around and email back out to you a link to everything. And that way you'll have it for to hold on to use as a very, very good resource as you start growing hydroponically. So let me escape from this. And let me stop sharing right there. And let's see. Oh my gosh, we're pretty much right on time here. I actually showed some good time management today. So let's see if anybody has any questions for me here. Bonnie asks, is there a pesticide for the fungus gnats? Technically, there are. I know that for commercial greenhouse operations, there is a type of beneficial nematode. If anybody doesn't know what that is, nematodes are microscopic roundworms that normally live in the soil, but a lot of them feed on other insects. So if you get the correct nematode And commercial companies do this. They get one species of nematode, they mass produce it, they package it, you mix it with water, and you basically water it into the media. Those nematodes will attack the fungus gnat larvae, their maggots, and help to reduce the population that way. Like I said, if you look really carefully at trying to reduce the moisture content of your media, and keep, like John said, you want to find that Goldilocks, you know, wet but not too wet. Right now, if you have a big fungus gnat problem, you're probably too wet. So you want to back off a little bit and find that really happy medium in between, where you don't have a huge problem of fungus gnats, but your plants are not suffering from lack of irrigation also. So let me go back up to where I was here. Spider mites also hate wind or a fan or air blowing over them. Yes, there's a few things that fungus gnat or spider mites, I'm sorry, really don't like. And spider mites are a funny little organism because they are so tiny. I'll throw in a little bit of trivia here. Spider mites do not excrete their waste products. They leave through their skin, basically. They are so small that they don't excrete or urinate out the back end of the spider mite. It leaves through their cuticle or their skin, basically. So spider mites like environments where it's fairly low humidity. That way, everything evaporates off of the surface of the spider mite very well. They really don't like moving air or blowing wind. That kind of disrupts them. It makes it a little bit less friendly for them. They do like very, very high temperatures. So outdoors in Florida, you're going to run across spider mites as being a major problem. Generally July, August, September. The heat of summer is that when they get the worst. If you keep things a little bit cooler, most of us don't keep the inside temperature of our houses at 95 or 100. So if you keep it at a reasonable temperature, spider mites are not going to feel as welcome in your house. Sometimes just trying to make these different pests less welcome, you're going to help to greatly reduce their rate of reproduction. I know spider mites under ideal circumstances, perfect humidity, really high temperatures, they can drop eggs and make new baby spider mites in an amazing rate. So if you vary the humidity, you vary the temperature, so it's less friendly, less favorable for spider mites. They won't reproduce anywhere nearly as fast, and that gives you a chance to physically go in there and take action and help to reduce their numbers also. So a lot of this part of IPM is you're not looking for that one bottle of spray that you can go to the store and buy, spray it, and now all your problems are solved. You're looking for a lot of different little things, different solutions, trying to understand the biology of the pest to help get the upper hand and get them under control. So Max says, thank you, Doctors Robert and Lester, great stuff. Thank you very much, Max. I think this is really great, and these guys are all great to work with. I think we'll keep in touch, and we'll try to do more hydroponics things because we all work together and have a really good time doing these kind of things. Can you share a type or brand of lens you like? Very good question. I know, and I'm not specifically giving a plug for any one company, but if you go on Amazon.com, because Amazon sells everything basically, and look under Jewelers Loupes, L-O-U-P-E, you can find a huge variety of Jewelers Loupes or hand lenses. I like a small foldable one. I generally use either a 10x or a 20x. Anything that magnifies more than that, I really don't use for a hand lens. If it's something that's smaller than that, I'm going to pick it off because I do have a dissecting microscope. I guess not everybody does, but if I have to get a better look at it or it's really, really small, I'll move to a microscope. But a hand lens that has both a 10x and a 20x or so is going to work really well. They're nice because they fold up. You can fit them in your pocket, or I have one that's on a string that goes around your neck, so it's always handy. when you're looking under leaves, like I have to do a lot, turn a leaf over and you're looking at them with the hand lens. Some of these pests can be very, very, very tiny. And if you're not using some kind of magnification, you're never going to figure out exactly what they are. And then you're never going to get the correct solution or treatment for it. Okay, Rick asked, what would be best for the bumblebee colored grasshoppers eating my plants? Okay, I guess we're kind of veering off into questions about everything here. What you're probably asking about is lubber grasshoppers. And right now they're still pretty small. The best thing to do with lubber grasshoppers is mix up a big bucket of water with either bleach or rubbing alcohol in it and grab those grasshoppers and throw them in that. That's the best way to humanely dispatch of them. They are difficult to control with chemical sprays because pretty soon their cuticle or their skin is going to get so thick, there's very, very few chemical sprays that are going to be really effective on controlling them. So we'll go ahead and I'll pick out 2 more questions to answer here. Like I said, we will put up all of our contact information at that web page when we have it set up. We'll email everybody. Please don't be going to the web page looking for things because there will be nothing there until Monday. When you go and it no longer asks for a password, you just click and go in. That means we have everything there. So let's see what else. If using grow lights, what color temperature do most crops respond best to? John, are you still on here? Do you want to try to answer that one? Either John or Maxine? I can see you're both still on here.
Hey, can you hear me?
Sure, I can hear you. Go right ahead. Why don't you go ahead and give that one a shot. Using grow lights, what color temperature do most crops respond best to?
So surprisingly, yeah, I was talking to Hannah about this, and we think like there's not a lot out there in terms of doing it specifically for microgreens. But we've found, the little that we have found is that your standard fluorescent light bulbs are usually enough of, in terms of enough energy for the plants and is close enough to the spectrum that plants require, that those often are, good enough for the purposes of microgreens, if that's what you're trying to do. I mean, it gets much more sophisticated the longer you grow plants and, in terms of how they respond to it. But for microgreens, if you just want to give them more light, it's really not going to make too big of a difference.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was really great. I see Karen says, thank you from Missouri. Before we sign off here, for anybody who might be in a state outside of Florida, just go ahead and say real quick in the chat box what state you're in, because I know that we do have people from outside of Florida, and I forgot to ask earlier about exactly how many we had. So obviously we have somebody from Missouri. That's great. Oh my gosh, we have Washington, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. That's great. And the information, part of what I spoke with the different insect pests are going to be a little bit more specific to what we deal with here in Central Florida. But a lot of these pests are really cosmopolitan. I know people across probably the entire world have some type of fruit fly and fungus gnats. And you may have different species of mealy bugs than we have here in Central Florida, but you have your mealy bugs also. So hopefully this information was all very helpful to all of you. Hopefully you will all go ahead and set up some kind of hydroponic setup. And the very last thing I want to mention, and this is very, very important, in about a month or so, for everybody who tuned in and watched the video, either this live or the videos of this presentation, yesterday's and today's, we're going to send you a very brief survey, because we like to get an idea of how we did. Did we give you information that actually helped you get into hydroponics, improve your hydroponics? I'm a big believer in very, very brief surveys. I don't send out 10-page surveys. I send out like 5-minute surveys. So if you guys can help us out and show your appreciation for this wonderful 2-day free workshop, if you could take just a few minutes when you get the email with our survey and click on the link and go ahead and answer those few questions, we really, really appreciate it. So I think it's about time for us to wrap it up here. John, Maxine, and Hannah, who was on yesterday, this is great. You guys are a lot of fun to work with, and hopefully everybody else did a great job. And like I said, look for video recordings of yesterday's session and today's. It'll be up on that website on Monday, and we will be sure to email everybody with a link for that. And hopefully you'll get out there this weekend and start some hydroponic setups. So with that, thank you very much. Everybody stay safe out there, and we'll see you again really soon. Thank you.